Well, we just reviewed NES Remix for the Wii U, and we're still playing NES Remix pretty much non-stop, so we thought, what the hell? Let's dig into the Wii U's Virtual Console and go back to the originals, to the ones that, for me at least, were my introductions to this whole gaming thing. I was already a huge fan of Donkey Kong when I found out. The monkey doesn't fall far from the bigger monkey. It's Donkey Kong Jr. for the Nintendo Wii U. Donkey Kong Jr. is one of my favorite games, and especially one of my favorite sequels, especially in retrospect. But you can see in Donkey Kong Jr. a lot of the things that would define the next round of Donkey Kong classics, specifically the Donkey Kong Country titles. So it's like Donkey Kong Jr. is the bridge that connects this franchise's two very distinct eras, and the first way it does that is by changing the gameplay. In fact, that's really one of the coolest things about this game. And it only came a year after the original, and yet Nintendo was already experimenting and pushing the concept further. And that's crazy. Donkey Kong was a groundbreaking game, arguably the very first platformer. And for the second one, Nintendo was already like, let's tweak it a bit. So where Donkey Kong was primarily about jumping and really traditional platforming in the old school sense, Donkey Kong Jr. is more about climbing. I mean, it's still a platform game, obviously, but it's an evolution of the concept. So now instead of jumping from platform to platform, you're mostly climbing from vine to vine, from chain to chain. And this really changes the feel of Donkey Kong Jr., even though it's still the same genre, and it's still using a very similar blueprint. It's not a radically different game, but it feels different enough to be interesting and distinct, which makes it the perfect kind of sequel. And again, one of the coolest things about it in retrospect is the game's Donkey Kong countryness. Obviously, that's due to the efforts of Rare, and how they were able to reinvent the franchise while also keeping familiar elements intact. But I think it would have been a lot harder for them to do that without this game's boldness. I mean, gone is the trademark construction site and the steel girders. This one takes the Donkey Kong series to the jungle, which is where Rare picked it up a decade later. And there are those Snapjaw sprites, which look very similar to Country's claptraps. I mean, again, this is all in retrospect, but going back to it, it's cool how Donkey Kong Jr. feels like the fulcrum that balances the franchise. It's a little Donkey Kong and a little Donkey Kong Country. Now, one of the things that made the original game so influential is that it was the first video game to really focus on telling a story, and so it only makes sense that story would be one of the driving elements of the sequel as well. I mean, Donkey Kong Jr. is perhaps best known as being the one that turned Mario heel. Having captured Donkey Kong in the original, Mario holds him captive. It's up to Jr. to save his dad from the bad guy, from Mario. How cool is that? And like its predecessor, the story of Donkey Kong Jr. unfolds with each level. Jr. chases him through the jungle before finally reaching Mario's hideout, where dangerous electric traps await him. And once he gets through, his dad's cage is in sight. This is one of my favorite boss levels from any NES game. You have to push all 6 keys into the locks to set Donkey Kong free, at which point, happy ending. And it's awesome because, like the original, it tells a complete story, but also because that boss level condenses all the things that define Donkey Kong Jr. into one really clever, really fun level. To me, Donkey Kong Jr. has always been a textbook example of how to make sequels. You know, it's an extension of the first game, but it's also different enough to have its own identity. And it's amazing to me that at a time when most sequels were just swapping pixels for the same gameplay, Donkey Kong Jr. was this ambitious. And that music rules. It's one of the best Donkey Kong games, one of Nintendo's most creative early efforts, and one of my personal favorites. It's Donkey Kong Jr. on the Nintendo Wii U.